Welcome, guys. Today we are going to talk about rounding whole and decimal numbers. Kind of talking about them at the same time makes sense since the process that we use to round whole and decimal numbers are the same. So let's go ahead and let's start with whole numbers. So let's say, for example, I had a number 275. Okay, and I said, well, let's round that to the hundreds place. What would that round to? What is that about? Well, we have to look at the number behind it, okay? The 7. The 7 is going to determine how we relate that number. And I sometimes say you could think of it in your head like a number line. I have to determine, is that number closer to 200 or 300? And that's why that number right behind it is going to be important. Now, halfway between 200 and 300 is 250. And the saying we say in class, 5 or more means we're going to raise the score. 4 or less, and we're going to let it rest. So the 7 would be 5 or more. And as you know, 275, that would put it on this side of the number line. So naturally, that number then is going to round to 300. Everything else would become zeros. But that's why we use that little saying. It relates to that number line. Where is that position in terms of closer to the 200 spot or 300 spot? Okay? Now let's look at a slightly larger number. Let's say we had 15,782. Okay? And let's say, though, we were rounding to a smaller place value, the tens place. Well, thinking of that number line again, I'm going to have to ask myself, is that number closer to 15,780? Or is that number closer to 15,790? Okay, that's the determining factor. Notice that tens place here is the one that's changing. Well, like the problem before, I'm going to look to the number behind it because that's going to kind of determine where on this number line it fits. Now, I always like to kind of put that halfway mark. And I know that halfway would be 15,785, that 5 being that halfway, 0.5 or 5 directly between the two. Well, looking at my original number, I see it would be on this end of the number line. So 4 or less, we're going to let that rest. The 2 is 4 or less. So when I round that, that would be 15,780. Now, decimals, when I round decimals, the process is exactly the same. Try to find that halfway point and determine, would that decimal be halfway or more to my next number? Because if it is halfway or more, it would go up. So let's say I had the decimal 4 and 83 hundredths. And I want to round to the tenths place, okay? So I'm going to use the number behind it, just like I would have a whole number. And I'm going to try to figure out, well, where would that go? What would that round to? So when I think about my number line, where does this number fit between 4 and 80 hundredths and 4 and 90 hundredths? So here's my halfway point, and that would be, of course, 4 and 85, 5, that halfway mark. Well, 4 and 83 hundredths, that would be on this side of the number line. So in this case, the 8 would stay the same. Everything else would turn to zeros. So my rounded number would be 4 and 80 hundredths, which, if you want to think about it more simply, you could also write as 4 and 8 tenths. They are equivalent. All right, so another example, if I had 20 and 83 thousandths, and I was going to round to, say, the hundreds, hundredths place, sorry. Let's look to the number behind it and think about how would that number affect that decimal. So when I think of my number line, I'm going between 20 and 80 thousandths and 20 and 90 thousandths. Excuse me. My halfway point would be that 5, that 85 thousandths. Okay, so looking at my original number, I see 83 would be on this side of the number line. That 3 is less than 4, 4 or less, let it rest. That 8 will not change. One thing students need to remember, anything in front of that number will stay the same as well. So it's not as though every single number turns to a 0. All of the front numbers would stay the same. Only that last digit would turn to a 0. Which, because of that, I could leave that N0 off and just write 20 and 8 hundredths. That's also equivalent. Alright, I hope you have a pencil and paper in front of you. I'd like you to take a minute, pause my video, write down these 4 problems, and try to round to the place value that I've underlined. Pause the video. Alright, hopefully you've gotten through all 4. Looking at my first problem, I would look to the 4 to see what that would do to my hundredths place, the 7 that's in the hundredths place. 4 or less would let it rest, so that means the numbers in front would stay the same and everything else would turn to a 0. And number 2, another whole number, look to the number behind it, and I see that it's a 9, and I remember that 5 or more means I'm going to raise the score. So that 8, that would push that 8 over to the 9. All the other digits behind it would become a 0. Moving on to number 3, now we're in our decimal places. So I'm looking at the tenths place, so look to the hundredth. 5 or more raise the score. So that 6 would round to a 7, and the other digits could become zeros, or since they're decimals, I could leave them off, but I'll write them in for you. And lastly, number 4, the 7 is higher than 5. 5 or more raise the score. The numbers in the front will not be affected, so the 8 will turn to a 9. Everything behind that place value turns to a 0. Hope you did good. Keep up the good work, guys. Thanks.